John Westbrook had always prided himself on his work ethic. As an elderly man, nearing his 65th birthday, he could look back at a life that had been built on years of sweat and sacrifice. He had come from humble beginnings, raised by parents who had to struggle to put food on the table. John, however, wasn't afraid of hard work. He worked tirelessly, building his business from the ground up, slowly, painstakingly, but with determination. Over the years, his company had grown into something he could be proud of. A well-established home improvement business with a reputation for quality and reliability. He had become a man known for his integrity and ability to provide. But more than the business, it was his family that John held dear. He had married Maria when they were both young, and together they had raised their son Ryan. John had always hoped that Ryan would follow in his footsteps, carrying on the legacy of hard work and dedication. But things hadn't turned out that way. Ryan had always been a dreamer. He was charismatic and full of potential, but he had never quite figured out how to turn his talents into a stable career. As a child, Ryan was always more interested in art, music, and philosophy than the nitty-gritty of running a business. John had tried to guide him, offering advice and opportunities, but Ryan had always brushed him off, preferring to chase the next big idea rather than knuckle down and build a future. Despite his son's lack of direction, John had always been there for him. Through every financial setback, every failure, and every poor decision, John was the one who picked up the pieces. He had taken out loans, refinanced his house, and sacrificed his own savings to help Ryan get back on his feet. The most recent of these sacrifices had been covering the mortgage payments for a house Ryan and his wife, Samantha, could never have afforded on their own. John knew that the money was slipping through his fingers like sand, but he did it anyway. For Ryan. For family. The idea of family had always been sacred to John. He'd spent his entire life building a life that he could pass down to his son. Everything he had, his home, his business, his savings, he wanted to share it with Ryan. He had worked hard so that Ryan would have the opportunities he never did. But in the last few years, John had begun to feel like something was slipping through his fingers that money couldn't fix. A connection, a bond, a simple respect for the sacrifices he had made. The Christmas season had always been special to John. Every year, he would gather with his family, sitting around the table with a turkey and all the fixings. It was a time to reflect, to give thanks, and to enjoy the love and companionship of family. This year, though, would be different. It started with the phone call. John had just returned from his morning walk, the crisp winter air biting at his face as he made his way back to his modest home. He had been feeling a bit of an ache in his bones lately, a sign of the years catching up to him. But he had learned to ignore it. As he entered the house, the familiar scent of coffee and cinnamon filled the air. Maria had always made the house smell like that, warm, inviting, and full of love. But Maria had been gone for 2 years, and now it was just him. He set his coat down on the hook by the door and walked into the living room, where the Christmas tree stood, decorated with ornaments Maria had collected over the years. He smiled at the memories, but there was a gnawing sadness inside him. The house felt emptier without her. His phone rang. It was Ryan. John's heart gave a small leap. He hadn't heard from him in a few days, but he had grown used to these short gaps. Ryan was busy with work, with his life, and it was hard to get a hold of him. John answered the call with a warm greeting. "Hey, Ryan, how's everything going?" John asked, sitting down in his old recliner. "Hey, Dad," Ryan replied, his voice a little hesitant, a little distant. "I've got something I need to talk to you about." John's stomach twisted at the tone. Something wasn't right. "What's going on, son?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. John could hear faint murmurs in the background, the sound of people talking, laughing, maybe preparing for something. Then Ryan spoke again. "I need to let you know something. We've been talking about Christmas and, well, you're not going to be welcome at our house this year. Samantha and her parents, they don't want you here." John felt like the air had been knocked out of him. He blinked in disbelief, his hand gripping the phone so tightly that his knuckles went white. What do you mean, Ryan?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I've been coming to Christmas dinner for years. What do you mean, I'm not welcome?" Ryan's voice was quieter now, tinged with discomfort. "Dad, it's just, well, Samantha's family. They're very traditional. They don't really get along with you. You're just too old-fashioned for them, I guess. They don't want someone like you at the table." John's heart dropped. He felt an overwhelming wave of hurt wash over him. The rejection, the casual way Ryan said it, stung more than he could express. His son, the one he had sacrificed everything for, was now telling him he was too much of a burden to share Christmas with. "Too old-fashioned?" John repeated, his voice quiet, the disbelief still fresh. "Ryan, I've given you everything. I've paid for everything you have. I've worked myself into the ground to help you, to give you a chance at something better." "I know, Dad," Ryan said quickly, but his words sounded hollow, as if he didn't quite believe them himself. "But it's just easier this way. You know how her family is. It's better if you don't come." John's mind was spinning. His son was turning his back on him for his wife's family. He had worked his whole life for this moment. To provide, to help, to be a part of Ryan's life, and now it felt like everything had come crashing down in an instant. "I see," John said, his voice strained. He didn't know what else to say. He wanted to scream, to demand an explanation, but it felt pointless. This wasn't just about Christmas dinner. It was about something deeper, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. He had given everything to his family, and yet here he was, being cast aside like an old, outdated object. "I'll let you go, Ryan," John said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "Enjoy your Christmas. I'm sure Samantha's family will make it a perfect one." "Dad, I'm sorry," Ryan said quickly, but John had already ended the call. He sat there for a long time, staring at the phone in his hand, unsure of what to feel. Hurt, anger, disbelief. But most of all, there was an overwhelming sense of betrayal. The realization hit him hard. After everything he had done for them, after all the sacrifices, the late nights, the years of financial support, he was nothing more than a financial tool, used only when it was convenient for them. He had been cast aside, just like everything else in his life that had lost its value. John sat in silence, staring at the Christmas tree, the lights flickering like tiny stars in the darkness. He thought about all the Christmases he had spent here with Maria, all the years he had worked for a future that now seemed to be slipping through his fingers. And he wondered, not for the first time, how he had let himself become invisible in his own family. It was time for a change that would no longer involve him giving without ever receiving anything in return. The days after the phone call were a blur for John. He couldn't bring himself to talk to anyone. Not his friends, not his neighbors, not even the old man he had lunch with at the diner every Wednesday. The rejection festered in him, a constant ache that gnawed at his insides. He had been so proud of his family, so willing to do whatever it took to help them. And yet, in the span of a few moments, everything he thought he had built with Ryan had crumbled. His son, his flesh and blood, had cast him aside for a life that John couldn't understand, one that was shallow, self-serving, and in his mind full of empty promises. John sat in his recliner, staring out of the living room window at the street outside. The quiet of his home was suffocating. The house felt too big now that Maria was gone, and with Ryan rejecting him, it felt even emptier. The Christmas tree sat in the corner, its lights blinking weakly, as if even it felt the loss of holiday cheer. He had always prided himself on being a provider, on being the one his family could rely on. But this wasn't how he had imagined it would end. The phone call kept replaying in his mind. Ryan's words echoed in his ears. "It's just easier this way, Dad. You know how her family is." Her family? The words felt like a slap across his face. All the years he had spent building his business, all the hours of hard work, all the money he had given, and for what? So that Ryan could be part of a world where John didn't belong? But no more. The more John thought about it, the clearer it became. He had spent too many years being used. And the worst part was that he had allowed it. He had sacrificed his own happiness, his own peace, for them. And for what? A cold, distant phone call that left him feeling invisible and unappreciated? The rejection had broken something inside him. But it also awakened something else, a resolve. He could feel the seed of anger take root. But it wasn't the kind of anger that made him want to lash out mindlessly. No, this was a different kind. A quiet, methodical anger that made him think. For the first time, John realized he had been taken for granted, that his sacrifices were never truly appreciated, and that perhaps it was time to stop being the silent benefactor in a story where he played no meaningful role. That night, as he sat alone in the dim light of his kitchen, John began to make a plan. John's mind was as sharp as it had ever been when it came to business. He had spent decades analyzing costs, making investments, and finding ways to ensure that his company stayed afloat. Now he would turn those skills toward something more personal, his family. He started by grabbing his old leather-bound notebook, the one Maria had bought him for their anniversary years ago. She had always encouraged him to keep track of his financials, even in retirement. The cover was worn, the pages yellowing, but it still felt like an old friend. He opened it and began writing down every figure, every dollar he had sent to Ryan and Samantha over the years. It didn't take long for John to be shocked by the numbers. As he added up the mortgage payments he'd made, the credit card bills he had covered, the vacations he had funded, Ryan and Samantha had been living a life that was far beyond their means, and all of it had been on John's dime. He had been their safety net, their ATM, and they had never once stopped to think about the toll it had taken on him. Over the past 5 years, he had given them more than $140,000. That was not even counting the initial down payment on their house, the kitchen renovation that Samantha had insisted on, or the endless requests for small loans that Ryan had promised to pay back, but never did. John had sacrificed his own savings, dipped into his retirement fund, and even taken out a second mortgage on his own home to help them. He calculated the numbers again, just to be sure, but the total came out the same. $140,000, more than he had spent on himself in the last decade, more than his entire savings had amounted to. Gone. He couldn't help but feel the weight of that money, the sacrifice it represented. All the while they had lived in luxury, never once considering the cost of their comfortable life. And now, in the span of a single phone call, it had all come crashing down. John closed the notebook and set it down on the kitchen table. His mind was clear now. It was time to take action. The first step in his plan was simple. He would stop the financial support immediately. He would call the bank the next day and cancel the automatic mortgage payments that had been siphoning his savings for years. But it wasn't just about cutting off the money. No, John had a deeper plan. One that would expose the truth, not just to Ryan and Samantha, but to their world, to the people who had always treated him like an outsider. He would make sure they all knew exactly how much he had given, how much he had sacrificed, and how little he had received in return. John began to compile evidence. He made copies of every bank statement, every receipt for the home renovations, every credit card bill he had paid. He even printed out photos from their lavish vacations, the ones they had taken while he struggled to keep his own home in good repair. He would show everyone the truth about the life he had financed. It was time for him to be seen, to be heard, to make sure that his sacrifices were no longer invisible. But John knew he couldn't just show up and start demanding attention. He had to be strategic. Samantha's family, with their fancy dinners and social circles, had no idea how much he had truly done for them. They saw him as a relic of the past, someone who didn't fit into their modern world. Well, he would show them just how much they depended on the past and on him. As he prepared for the next step, John's thoughts shifted to Samantha's parents, particularly her father, Harold, a man who had always looked down on him. John knew that Harold had never respected him. From the first moment they had met, Harold had made it clear that he thought John was beneath him. He was a businessman, sure, but one from a bygone era. Not a man who fit into their world of flashy cars, expensive dinners, and high society parties. But John knew something about Harold. He had connections, people who could make things happen. And John intended to use those connections to his advantage. He would go to them. Not in a desperate attempt to plead his case, but to expose the ugly truth. He would show them how they had used him, manipulated him into believing that his sacrifices meant something. He would make them see that the man they had cast aside was no fool. And when they saw the numbers, when they saw the proof of just how much he had given, they would have no choice but to acknowledge his worth. John sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of the plan settling into his bones. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about hurting anyone. It was about justice. For years, he had given without expecting anything in return. But now, it was time for him to reclaim what was his dignity, his respect, and his right to stand up and be counted. Tomorrow, he would call the bank. He would cancel the payments. And then he would begin the next phase of his plan, exposing the truth. It was time for Ryan, Samantha, and their world to understand just how much John Westbrook had sacrificed, and how, finally, he was taking it all back. John woke up the next morning with a newfound sense of clarity. The weight that had been hanging over him for days, even weeks, began to lift as the resolve settled in. He knew what he had to do. No more second-guessing, no more staying silent, no more being the man who silently suffered for the sake of family. Today, he would start taking control back. He sat at his kitchen table, his coffee cup forgotten beside him as he gathered his thoughts. He had already made the decision to cut off Ryan's financial lifeline, the mortgage payments. It was a simple step, But it was a bold one, a declaration of his independence. For years, John had been the one holding everything together financially, making sure Ryan and Samantha never had to face the consequences of their extravagant lifestyle. But now, that was over. John had been meticulous in calculating every penny he had sent over the years. As he picked up his phone, a slight tremor ran through his fingers, not from fear, but from the anticipation of taking the first real step toward reclaiming his life. He had never thought that he would find himself in this position, but here he was, on the verge of something that would change everything. He dialed the bank number, his fingers brushing over the digits as he prepared himself for the conversation. The phone rang, the sound a dull hum in the quiet of the house. When the operator answered, John's voice was steady but firm. "Hello, this is John Westbrook. I'd like to cancel the automatic mortgage payments that have been set up for Ryan Westbrook's account. Please cancel them effective immediately." The operator didn't hesitate. "Of course, Mr. Westbrook. Can you confirm the account number and provide some verification?" John recited the details without hesitation, the numbers flowing from memory. His mind was clear now, no longer clouded with guilt or doubt. He had made this decision with purpose. The operator clicked away at her keyboard, and within moments, John was told that the cancellation had been processed. No more payments, no more obligations. "Your request has been successfully completed, Mr. Westbrook. Is there anything else I can assist you with today?" John's heart pounded in his chest, but for the first time in years, it wasn't from stress or fear. It was from the exhilarating sensation of regaining control. "No, that will be all." "Thank you," he said, his voice calm but filled with a sense of triumph. He hung up the phone and sat back in his chair, the weight of the decision settling in. His mind began to race, his thoughts sharper than they had been in a long time. He had just taken the first step, but now it was time to take the next. The next few hours were a blur of activity as John began preparing for the next phase of his plan. He had been waiting for this moment, and now that he had made the decision to stop being Ryan's financial crutch, it was time to make a statement. His thoughts drifted to the one thing he had always wanted but had never allowed himself to indulge in: a suit. John had always believed in practicality. A man who worked hard didn't need fancy clothes, he thought. But now, as he stood in front of his bedroom mirror, he felt the pull of something different, a desire for dignity, for respect, for the man he had spent so many years trying to be. The man who had been a silent giver, a shadow in the background of his own life. He had never bought himself something extravagant, not once, not when the money he made always seemed to go to someone else. But now, with the mortgage payment stopped and his future open before him, John felt like it was time to treat himself. He found the perfect suit, a dark navy, tailored to perfection, a classic style that would never go out of fashion. It wasn't the most expensive one on the rack, but it was the one he had eyed for years. It had always been just out of reach, a symbol of everything he had never allowed himself to have. Today, though, it was his. He paid for it in cash, feeling a wave of pride as he handed over the money. As he stood in front of the mirror at the store, admiring how the suit fit him perfectly, John couldn't help but smile. It wasn't just about the suit, it was about the change. The change in how he saw himself, and how he was finally taking back the life he had allowed others to take from him. Later that evening, John returned home and began his preparations. He had already made his decision. He would confront Ryan and Samantha, but he wouldn't do it in the way they might expect. He wasn't going to plead or beg for understanding. No, John had come to realize that respect had to be earned, and it was time for him to demand his. He spent the evening meticulously organizing his documents, bank statements, receipts for the house renovations, vacation photos that Ryan and Samantha had posted on social media. He printed everything out, each sheet representing a piece of the sacrifice he had made. Everything was neatly filed, each document clearly labeled with dates and amounts. There would be no room for denial, no room for excuses. The truth was there, laid out in black and white. John knew what he was about to do would be jarring, and it was a tactic he had thought long and hard about. He wasn't just going to cancel the payments and walk away. No, he would disrupt their world in a way they'd never forget. He would make them see exactly how much he had given up for their comfort, how much he had done to keep their lives afloat while they walked all over him. The next day, John dressed in his new suit, the fabric feeling like armor against the uncertainty of what lay ahead. He drove to Ryan and Samantha's house, a quiet determination filling his chest. The house that he had helped them buy, the furniture he had paid for, the renovations he had funded, all of it felt like a distant memory now. As he pulled into their driveway, he noticed the shiny new car parked outside, the expensive landscaping that he had helped pay for. The house was grand, but it was no longer a symbol of pride for him. It was a reminder of how little they valued him, how they had used him for their own gain. John parked his car and walked up to the front door. He didn't knock. He didn't need to. He had as much right to be there as anyone. He had given them everything, and now it was time for them to face the truth. He opened the door without hesitation and stepped inside. Ryan and Samantha were sitting in the living room, the Christmas decorations still up, a slight air of disarray in the space. They hadn't expected him, and their expressions were a mix of shock and confusion. John took a deep breath and set the folder of documents down on the coffee table. He spoke, his voice calm but firm, with a strength that surprised even him. "I think it's time we had a conversation about what I've given to this family," John said, his eyes never leaving Ryan's. "And about what I expect in return." The night of the Christmas dinner arrived with the familiar chill of December in the air. But John Westbrook didn't feel the cold. His car moved steadily through the streets of the neighborhood, a place that had once felt like home, a place he had helped build. As he drove, the lights of the city twinkled outside his window, reminding him of the lives his family had enjoyed, lives that, at one point, he had been proud to help create. But tonight was different. John wasn't driving to join in the holiday cheer. No, tonight was about something far more important, reclaiming his dignity. The folder beside him in the passenger seat contained everything he needed. It was thick with receipts, bank statements, mortgage records, and photos from their vacations, proof of the countless sacrifices he had made over the years. Proof of the countless times he had given and given, only to be cast aside when it no longer suited their needs. The decision was already made. This would be the final Christmas dinner he would ever spend under their roof. He wasn't going to ask for forgiveness or beg for a seat at their table. Instead, he was going to make them see the truth of what he had done for them, how they had used him, and how he had finally stopped being the silent benefactor in their charade of a family. As he approached Ryan and Samantha's house, the sight of it filled him with a strange mixture of anger and detachment. The grand house, which he had helped them buy, sat like a monument to everything that had gone wrong. The expensive landscaping he had funded, The high-end appliances, the designer furniture, everything in this house had been a direct result of his sacrifices. John parked his car in the driveway and sat for a moment, hands resting on the wheel. He could hear the faint sounds of laughter and the clink of silverware from inside. He knew they were gathered around the dinner table, eating the food he had provided, sitting in the chairs he had paid for. The thought was almost laughable, but it fueled his resolve. His heart pounded in his chest, not from fear, but from anticipation. Tonight, the truth would come to light, and he would make sure they never forgot it. John walked toward the front door, his suit jacket tailored perfectly, his stride confident, each step echoing in the still night air. The sounds from inside grew louder as he approached. He could hear Samantha's voice laughing, too brightly, and Ryan's deep chuckle joining in. But the moment his hand reached for the doorknob, something shifted inside him. The door wasn't locked. Of course it wasn't. They hadn't expected him to show up. They thought they had won. Without knocking, without hesitation, John opened the door. The warmth from inside flooded over him like a wave. The smell of turkey, roasted vegetables, and the faint scent of expensive wine filled the air. As he stepped inside, he was hit with the contrast between the grandiose, luxurious surroundings and the cold, empty feeling in his chest. He didn't belong here anymore, and he realized he never had. The moment the door opened, the room fell silent. Ryan, sitting at the head of the table, looked up first. His face was one of shock, then quickly shifted to one of discomfort. Samantha, beside him, was frozen mid-laugh, her glass of wine still suspended in the air. Their guests, all strangers to John, stared in stunned surprise. The atmosphere in the room shifted from cheerful holiday warmth to a cold, oppressive silence. John's presence seemed to loom over them all, like an unwelcome guest who had been allowed in without invitation. But this time, John wasn't just a guest. He wasn't even a family member. He was an enigma, a silent witness to their lives that they could no longer ignore. John walked into the room without saying a word, his eyes scanning the familiar space. He could see the photos on the walls, photos of Ryan and Samantha smiling together, celebrating the life he had helped fund. The decorations, the elaborate spread on the table. It was all a testament to the life they had built on his back. He walked calmly toward the dining table, where Samantha and Ryan were still staring at him. The guests watched, unsure of how to react. "Good evening," John said quietly, his voice steady, but laced with an undeniable edge. The words were simple, yet they carried a weight that silenced the room further. He didn't wait for them to respond. Instead, he placed the thick folder onto the table with a deliberate motion. It made a soft thud as it landed, and the sound seemed to reverberate in the quiet room. Ryan's face turned pale. Samantha's eyes flickered from the folder to John, confusion and defensiveness warring in her expression. She opened her mouth to speak, but John raised a hand, signaling her to be quiet. One by one, John began to pull the documents from the folder. He laid out bank statements first, the inked numbers stark and undeniable on the pages. He watched as the guests slowly leaned in. Curiosity piqued, their eyes moving from the documents to John. Ryan shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but he didn't speak. Samantha, still stunned, tried to compose herself but found herself unable to tear her gaze away from the papers. John moved methodically, placing each document on the table. Receipts for the renovations, mortgage records, and photos from the vacations that Ryan and Samantha had enjoyed while he had been working overtime, day after day. He placed a photo of their European vacation right in front of Samantha. It showed them smiling at the Eiffel Tower, laughing, carefree, completely oblivious to the sacrifices John had made to ensure they lived that life. The reality of what John had done, the way he had been manipulated, used, was laid out for them in front of everyone. The guests had no choice but to see it. One woman, sitting to the left of Ryan, picked up a receipt for a $3,000 purchase from a luxury store. She glanced at it, then back at Ryan. "You've been paying for all of this?" she asked, her voice a mix of disbelief and sympathy. Ryan didn't answer. His hands were clenched at his sides, but he couldn't look his father in the eye. He knew the truth was now inescapable. Another man, seated across from Samantha, spoke up, his voice laced with incredulity. You didn't tell us he was supporting you like this," he said, his voice soft, almost apologetic. He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable. John nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. "This is the truth," he said, his voice cutting through the air with cold clarity. "This is what I've done for you both. For years, I've worked to give you everything. I've built the life you live, and I've been ignored, pushed aside, and disrespected for it. All this time, I was nothing more than a walking ATM." A deep silence fell over the room. John's words hung in the air, the weight of his sacrifice impossible to ignore. He could see the guilt creeping into their faces, the realization that they had taken advantage of a man who loved them, a man who had given everything for their comfort and happiness. But the shame didn't last long. Samantha, ever the poised figure, recovered first. She straightened her back, her expression hardening. "I don't know what you think you're doing, John," she said, her voice sharp, "but this is not how you should be acting. We're a family." "A family?" John interrupted, his voice now rising. "A family doesn't treat each other like this. A family doesn't manipulate and use the person who's been there for them. You call this family, but all I've been is a source of money for you. A paycheck. That's not family, Samantha. That's exploitation." Ryan finally spoke, his voice cracking. "Dad, I didn't know it was this much. I didn't." John's gaze softened just slightly, but he held his ground. "It doesn't matter, Ryan. You had a choice, and you made it. You chose her family, and you let them dictate your life. You chose to let me fade into the background, and now you've lost me." The room was silent once more, but this time it was a silence of realization. John had laid bare the truth in front of them all. No one could ignore it now. The facade of family, the social mask they had worn so carefully, was gone. In its place was the raw truth, exposed for everyone to see. John stepped back, his hands still resting on the folder of documents. "Merry Christmas, everyone," he said, his voice low but resolute. "Enjoy your holiday. It will be the last one I'm paying for." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving them to face the consequences of their actions, unspoken words, unacknowledged debts, and the truth that would linger long after he was gone. The heavy silence lingered in the room, hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. The guests, still in shock from John's abrupt entry and the pile of documents on the table, now found themselves unwilling participants in an uncomfortable reckoning. It was clear from the looks on their faces, half of them embarrassed, the other half unsure what to make of the unexpected revelation, that John had taken them all by surprise. But John wasn't finished yet. This wasn't the end of his story. It was just the beginning. John slowly walked around the table, his gaze locking with each person in turn. He could feel the weight of their stares, the tension in the room rising as the truth he'd been holding inside for so long began to pour out. "You all have no idea what's been going on here, do you?" John's voice was steady, unshaken by the surprise or the discomfort around him. "You see the house, the expensive furniture, the vacations they take, and you think it's all because Ryan and Samantha worked hard to build it. You think they earned it. But the truth is, they didn't earn a damn thing. I did." He placed another stack of documents on the table, the sound of the paper scraping against the surface as he did so. He pulled out a few receipts and statements, dropping them one by one in front of the guests. "This is just a fraction of the mortgage payments I've made for them over the years," he said, pointing to the documents. $20,800 a month for 5 years. That's $168,000. I've kept them in this house, given them a life they could never afford, and all I've gotten in return is disrespect. The room was still, with only the quiet murmur of the furnace in the corner breaking the silence. Some guests, their faces turning pale, began to shuffle in their seats, glancing at each other nervously. It was evident that the reality of what John was saying was beginning to sink in. They'd seen the outward appearance of success. Ryan and Samantha had always appeared to be living a glamorous life. But now, they were learning that it had all come at the expense of someone else's sacrifice, and that someone was John. "You see," John continued, his voice growing firmer, "Ryan and Samantha never once stopped to ask themselves how much this was costing me. I refinanced my home to help fund their lavish lifestyle. I took out a second mortgage when Ryan lost his job, promised it would only be temporary. Yet here we are 5 years later, with me still footing the bill for their life of luxury, while they excluded me from the very family gatherings I helped create." John's eyes fixed on Samantha, who was sitting at the edge of her seat, her eyes darting between the documents and John. She hadn't spoken a word since John walked in, but the defensiveness was palpable in the way her posture stiffened. "Samantha," he said, his voice unwavering, "you and your family have always treated me like I was beneath you. You've made it clear from the start that I wasn't good enough to be part of your world, no matter how much I did for you. But you sure didn't mind taking my money, did you?" Samantha opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She closed it again, realizing that nothing she said could undo the damage. John didn't wait for her to answer. He moved on. "I wasn't just some guy who sent a check every month. I was the one who supported them. When Ryan wanted to buy new cars he couldn't afford, I was the one who paid for the vacations that they took without a second thought. And yet, I was excluded from every family holiday, every birthday, every important event that they had. They'd tell me it was too much trouble or they didn't have space, but the truth is, they didn't want me there." A murmur of disbelief swept through the room, but John wasn't done yet. He had spent too many years sitting on the sidelines, watching as they took everything from him. He was taking back his voice, his dignity, and his life. "I've sat in the background for years, biting my tongue, making excuses for them, but not anymore. Not when I'm forced to watch them live their lives without any appreciation for what I've done for them. It's not just the money. It's the way they've treated me, the way you've treated me." John's eyes now turned to Ryan, whose face was a mask of guilt, but also of fear. Fear of what his father was about to say next. "Ryan," John said, his voice softer now, but still filled with conviction, "you've allowed yourself to be controlled by them, by Samantha and her family. You've let them dictate your life, your decisions, and your relationship with me. You let them tell you that I wasn't good enough to be at your Christmas table. You let them tell you that my way of life, my values, were too outdated for you. But you know what? You're the one who's lost, not me." Ryan opened his mouth as if to speak, but the words seemed to stick in his throat. He looked around the room as if hoping someone would interject or somehow make this uncomfortable confrontation go away. But no one did. Not even Samantha. She had no argument left. All of her polished composure had crumbled in the face of the truth. John took a step closer, his gaze piercing Ryan's. "You've treated me like a fool, like a bank, and now that the money is cut off, you're going to have to face the consequences. You're going to have to stand on your own 2 feet, and you're going to have to earn your own way. No more hiding behind your wife's family's wealth. No more pretending to be someone you're not." Ryan flinched, but John could see the flicker of realization in his son's eyes. Ryan had never fully understood the extent of his father's sacrifices until now. Maybe, just maybe, this would be the wake-up call he needed. But John wasn't going to hold his breath. He had already made his peace with the possibility that Ryan might never change. As John finished speaking, the room sat in stunned silence. Some guests still held on to their disbelief, but others, those who had been watching from the sidelines, were beginning to see the manipulation for what it was. A few uncomfortable coughs broke the tension, but no one dared speak up. The truth had been laid bare, and there was no way to undo it. The stillness was broken when one of the dinner guests, an older woman who had been quietly observing, spoke up. I had no idea," she said, her voice shaky. "I didn't know it had been this bad." Others nodded in agreement, slowly starting to realize that what John had just revealed was far more than a simple dispute between father and son. It was a systematic exploitation of a man who had given everything and in return had been taken for granted. Ryan turned to Samantha, his face a mix of shame and frustration. He could see the cracks in her facade now, the damage done by the truth John had just exposed. Samantha's eyes darted between him and John, the weight of the moment settling heavily between them. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling. I didn't know it was this much, John. I didn't realize what you had done. I thought you wanted to help." She paused, but there was no apology in her tone, only a feeble attempt at justification. John shook his head. "You don't get it, Samantha. It's not just about the money. It's about the respect. I wasn't just helping you. I was trying to be part of your family. But you never saw me as anything but a means to an end." Samantha's face turned crimson with anger, but she had no words to fight back with. Ryan, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, finally stood up, his chair scraping against the floor as he did so. He looked down at his father, eyes filled with remorse. "Dad," Ryan said, his voice small, I didn't know. I didn't know what you were going through. I didn't realize how much you had done for us. And I'm sorry. I should have been there for you." John looked at his son, the man he had given so much for. His heart ached with the weight of the years spent trying to get through to Ryan. But now, as he saw the regret in his son's eyes, something shifted. There was a part of John that wanted to forgive him, wanted to believe that Ryan had learned his lesson. But forgiveness, John knew, wasn't enough. Not without action. Not without real change. The room was now filled with uncomfortable tension, the truth hanging heavy in the air. As John stood there, watching his family unravel before him, he felt a strange sense of clarity. This wasn't just about the money. This was about reclaiming his life, his dignity, and finally standing up for himself after years of being ignored and disrespected. "Now," John said, his voice calm but resolute, "you all know the truth, and as for me, I'm done. I'm done being your ATM. I'm done being your punching bag. The only way I'll ever be part of this family again is if there's genuine change. And that starts with you, Ryan. And you, Samantha." He turned, and without another word, he walked out of the room, leaving the stunned guests and a broken family behind. The moment John stepped out of the house, the quiet that followed his departure was deafening. The tension inside was palpable, thick, suffocating, like a storm that had finally broken. It wasn't just the shock of the moment, it was the realization that John's confrontation had shattered everything that Ryan and Samantha had carefully built. The family's carefully constructed image of success, of affluence and happiness had been torn apart in an instant, and now they were left to face the consequences. As John closed the door behind him, the sound of raised voices from inside pierced the air. He knew the argument had begun. He had known it would. Ryan and Samantha's guests were no longer polite bystanders. They were forced to pick sides, forced to reckon with the truth that John had exposed. From the driveway, John could hear Samantha's voice, loud and defensive. Her words were sharp, cutting through the tension like a knife. "That was completely inappropriate, Ryan." Samantha's voice was strained, and John could hear the crack of emotion behind her carefully constructed words. How could he just barge in like that, in front of everyone, our friends, our guests? Ryan's response was quieter, but John could hear the guilt in his son's tone. "I don't know, Sam. I didn't think it would go like this. I didn't think—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Didn't think what?" Samantha snapped. "That we'd get caught? That we'd have to actually face the reality of what we've been doing?" John shook his head as he walked down the front steps and toward his car. The pain of what had just transpired was sharp in his chest, but there was something else too. Something he couldn't quite place. It wasn't relief, not yet. It was more like an unsettling sense of clarity. He knew deep down that what he had done was necessary, but the mess that followed, it was only just beginning. John didn't go far. He parked his car a block away, just enough distance from Ryan and Samantha's house to give them space to sort through the mess he had left behind. He sat in the car, the engine off, staring out the windshield into the dark night. His thoughts were racing, yet he felt strangely calm, detached from the chaos inside. Then his phone rang. John didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was. Ryan's name flashed on the display, and with a deep, almost resigned sigh, John answered. "Dad," Ryan said softly, his voice heavy with emotion. "I'm sorry. I don't know what to say. I never meant for things to go this way." John's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He could hear the guilt in Ryan's voice, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to undo the years of sacrifice, the countless nights spent wondering when his son would finally appreciate him. John leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes for a moment to gather his thoughts before speaking. "It's too little too late, Ryan," John said quietly, his voice steady but tinged with an edge of hurt that he couldn't hide. "I've been giving and giving, and all I've gotten in return is disrespect. You let her and her family dictate your life. You let them control everything, including how you treated me." Ryan's silence on the other end of the line was deafening. John could almost picture him sitting there, shoulders hunched, staring at the floor, regretting his choices but knowing that words could never make up for what had already been done. "I know, Dad," Ryan said finally, his voice cracking. "I see it now. I'm sorry. I should have stood up for you. I should have never let her parents influence me like that. I should have been better." John took a deep breath. "Sorry doesn't fix this, Ryan. Sorry doesn't take back the years I spent helping you and your wife build this life that I'm not even allowed to be a part of. You've made your choices, and now you have to live with them." Ryan's apology felt hollow. The words he was speaking now were the same words John had heard time and again in his life. Regret, guilt, promises to do better. But they didn't undo the damage that had been done. They didn't erase the years of sacrifices that had been made with no thanks, no recognition. I need some time to think," Ryan said quietly, a tinge of desperation in his voice. "Can we talk later? Can we figure this out?" John didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched on, and he could feel his son's uncertainty on the other end of the line. But there was something about it that felt empty. Ryan's voice was filled with guilt, but John knew it wasn't just guilt. There was a lack of real understanding, a lack of real change. John had been fighting for years for that recognition, for that shift in his son's mind. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that Ryan's awakening was not something he could force. It had to come from within. John sighed and hung up the phone without another word. He knew there was nothing more he could do. The apology felt too little, too late. The damage was done, and the walls between them were only growing higher. Inside the house, the fallout from John's confrontation had only just begun. Samantha, whose calm facade had cracked in front of the guests, was now furiously pacing around the living room, trying to explain herself to the few remaining guests who hadn't yet left. Ryan sat on the couch, head in his hands, unable to meet anyone's eyes. "I can't believe he did that," Samantha was saying, her voice shaking with anger. "How dare he come in here and ruin everything? In front of my friends, my family. He made us look like villains, Ryan. He humiliated us." Ryan didn't respond at first, too lost in his own guilt to defend his father or his wife. The weight of what had just happened was settling over him like a thick fog, making it hard to breathe. He had never seen his father like this. So firm, so unapologetic, and so hurt. And yet, he had never really understood how much his father had sacrificed for him. Not until tonight. Finally, he looked up at Samantha. "I don't know, Sam," he said, his voice heavy. "I don't know what to think anymore. I never realized how much Dad had done for us." Samantha scoffed, brushing a strand of hair out of her face. "What are you saying? Are you going to side with him now? After everything he just did? He's the one who's ruined this Christmas, not me." Ryan shook his head, his mind racing with conflicting emotions. "I'm not siding with anyone, Sam. But he's right. I've been so caught up in everything you and your family wanted, I didn't even see it. I didn't see how much he was sacrificing for us. For me." Samantha's expression faltered for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "Don't let him manipulate you, Ryan. He's just trying to make you feel guilty." But Ryan didn't say anything more. He just sat there, feeling the weight of everything John had said sink in. Samantha continued to argue, but it was like a distant echo now. Her words no longer held the same power over him. John drove away from the house, his mind still processing the events of the night. He had done what he came to do, but the emotional toll was far from over. The confrontation had not only exposed their hypocrisy, it had forced a reckoning A painful moment where Ryan and Samantha could no longer hide from the truth. But as he drove down the empty streets, John realized something else. This wasn't just about money, or the dinners, or the holidays. This was about the choices they had made, and the ones they would continue to make. And as for John, he knew that no matter how hard it was to face the fallout, it was time for him to stand firm. It was time to let them face the consequences of their actions. And if Ryan truly wanted to make amends, he would have to prove it, not with words, but with actions. The days after the Christmas dinner were like an emotional hangover. John had expected some fallout, but nothing could have prepared him for the sheer intensity of what came next. The phone calls started almost immediately after he left Ryan and Samantha's house. At first, he didn't answer. He let them ring out, one after another, as he sat in the quiet of his home, his mind still reeling from the confrontation. But then the text messages started. They came from Ryan, from Samantha, and from people John had never even met. Some were apologetic, others defensive, trying to justify the actions of Ryan and Samantha. There were promises of reconciliation, pleas for forgiveness, and some that bordered on manipulative guilt trips. They all sounded the same, a vague attempt to smooth things over, to put the pieces of their fractured family back together without truly acknowledging the damage they had caused. John read each one in silence, the same quiet resolve settling in his chest. He felt no rush to respond. No matter what they said or how many times they apologized, John knew that words alone wouldn't fix what had been broken. He had spent years as the silent benefactor, the one who gave and gave without complaint, only to be discarded when it no longer suited their needs. This time, it wasn't going to be about forgiveness. It was going to be about respect, and he wasn't going to settle for anything less. For the first time in years, John wasn't just waiting for someone to come to him. He wasn't waiting for an apology to heal the rift. No, this time he was in control, and he wasn't about to let them make him feel guilty for taking a stand. As the days went on, the fallout from the Christmas dinner escalated. The story of John's financial support for Ryan and Samantha began to spread, and not just within their circle of friends and family. The local newspapers picked it up, running an article that painted John as a victim of exploitation, of a man who had been drained dry by his own family's greed. It wasn't long before social media exploded with the hashtag John Westbrook Exposed. Comments flooded in, both in support of John and in defense of Ryan and Samantha. The media frenzy only intensified the sense of alienation that John had felt for years. The public eye was now on him, and the public's reaction was mixed. Some sympathized with John, understanding the sacrifice he had made for his family. Others, however, focused on the drama of it all, judging John for airing his family's dirty laundry in such a public manner. John didn't care about the noise. He didn't care about what people said behind his back or what people who didn't know him thought. The only thing that mattered now was that he had done what he had set out to do, expose the truth, and he had no intention of backing down. Still, the days were long. He spent most of his time at home, his mornings beginning with a cup of coffee, sitting alone at his kitchen table, reading through the latest headlines. He tried to focus on the silence, to embrace the stillness of his home, but the weight of the situation always lingered. One morning, as John sat in his usual spot by the window, he noticed the buzz of his phone on the table. Another message from Ryan. "Dad, can we meet? I know it's been rough, but I really want to talk. I know I messed up, and I want to make things right." John stared at the message for a long time before replying. The words he had spoken to Ryan at the dinner still echoed in his mind. His son's apology, although sincere, felt too little, too late. But he also knew that this was the moment he had been waiting for. The moment when Ryan would have to prove that he was serious about change. He had been given an ultimatum, and now it was time to see if he would step up. John sat back in his chair, taking a deep breath as he tapped out his response. "We can meet, but this time, we're going to talk about more than just apologies. If you're serious about fixing this, you're going to have to show me that you mean it." The meeting was set for the following afternoon. John spent the morning preparing himself. He didn't know what to expect from Ryan, but he knew one thing. This conversation would be different. It wouldn't be about soothing egos or pretending everything was fine. It would be a reckoning. John arrived at the coffee shop early. It was a small, quiet place, a far cry from the luxurious cafes Samantha would frequent, the ones with white marble countertops and baristas that made overpriced lattes. John chose a seat in the back corner, away from the other customers. The noise of the bustling cafe seemed miles away as he sipped his coffee, his fingers tracing the rim of his mug. He had no idea how Ryan would approach this meeting. Would he come with more apologies? More promises of change? Or would he try to defend Samantha and her family again, like he had done so many times before? John didn't want to speculate. He didn't want to get his hopes up. Whatever happened, he knew he had to stand firm. He was tired of being the one who was always there to pick up the pieces. Ryan arrived right on time, looking a little more disheveled than usual. His clothes weren't as sharp as they had been in the past, and there was a weariness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. John observed him quietly as Ryan approached the table, his expression hesitant but sincere. "Hey, Dad," Ryan said, sitting down across from him. "Thanks for meeting me." John didn't immediately respond. He studied his son, noticing the subtle changes, the lines on his face, the tiredness in his posture. For the first time, John saw Ryan for what he really was, a man who had made mistakes, who had been lost, and who now had to deal with the consequences. "You wanted to talk," John said quietly. "So talk. But don't think for a second that this is going to be like the last time we had this conversation. I've given everything, Ryan, and I'm done just listening to words." Ryan swallowed, nodding slowly. "I get that. I know I've messed up. I've been blind to everything you've done for me, for us. I've let Samantha and her family control my life, and I've treated you like crap because of it. And for that, I'm sorry." John leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Ryan's. The apology, though heartfelt, still felt inadequate. "Sorry doesn't change things, Ryan," John replied, his voice calm but unwavering. "It doesn't bring back the years I spent giving you everything I had. It doesn't bring back the family we used to be. And it sure as hell doesn't make up for the fact that you let someone else dictate your life while I was working myself into the ground to support you." Ryan winced, the words hitting him harder than he had anticipated. But he didn't look away. He sat there, shoulders slumped, facing the truth of what he had done. "I don't know what to say to that, Dad. You're right. I've been selfish. I've taken advantage of you for far too long, and I'm ashamed of it. I've been trying to fix things with Sam, but I know that it's not just about her. It's about me, too. I've got a lot to make up for." John nodded, his expression softening just slightly. "Making it up isn't going to be easy. It's going to take more than just promises. I've spent 5 years paying for your house, your vacations, your lifestyle. And you've been a ghost to me. You've treated me like I was invisible. It's going to take more than words for me to believe you're serious about changing." Ryan sat in silence for a long moment, his hands resting on the table, his fingers tapping nervously. Then finally, he spoke again. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness right now, Dad. I don't expect that. But I'm going to prove to you that I'm ready to change. I'm ready to stand on my own 2 feet. No more using you. No more depending on you to fix everything. I don't know how to make things right, but I'll start by taking responsibility for what I've done." John studied him for a moment. He could see the sincerity in Ryan's eyes, but the doubt still lingered. It wasn't just about words anymore. It was about the actions that would follow. "We'll see, Ryan," John said, his voice firm, "but you better be ready to show me you mean it." As John walked out of the coffee shop later, he felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension. Ryan's words were a start, but they were only words. Whether or not his son could change, whether or not their relationship could ever truly heal, was still uncertain. But one thing was clear: John had taken the first step, and now the real work had begun. The repercussions of his actions were just starting to unfold. The morning sunlight streamed through the blinds, casting long shadows across John's living room. His coffee sat untouched on the table, cooling as he stared at the empty chair across from him. He had spent the better part of the morning thinking, replaying the events of the past few weeks in his mind. His mind was a jumble of emotions: anger, regret, disappointment. But there was also something else, something quieter: hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. John had received another message from Ryan earlier that morning. His son wanted to meet again. Ryan hadn't said much in the text, just that he had something important to say. John had felt a tug of uncertainty in his chest, but he knew one thing. If Ryan truly wanted to make amends, if he was truly serious about understanding the depth of the hurt he had caused, then this meeting would be crucial. John had agreed, and now, as he waited for Ryan to arrive, he tried to clear his mind, tried to prepare himself for whatever was coming. He couldn't help but think about how different this moment was from the man Ryan used to be, the confident, almost arrogant young man who had taken John's sacrifices for granted. The Ryan he had just met was broken, smaller, and much less sure of himself. John wasn't sure if that was a good thing or not, but it was a start. It wasn't enough, but it was a beginning. The sound of the doorbell broke the silence, and John's heart gave a quiet lurch. He stood slowly, his legs feeling heavier than they should as he walked to the door. When he opened it, Ryan stood there, looking nothing like the son he remembered. Gone was the youthful arrogance, the confident smile that had so often made John feel like an outsider. Instead, Ryan looked like a man who had been stripped of everything he thought he knew about himself. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes red-rimmed as though he hadn't slept in days, his hands fidgeting nervously with the cuffs of his sleeves. There was no bravado, no pretenses, just a man who had come face to face with the consequences of his actions. Ryan opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. Instead, he simply stood there, looking like he was searching for the strength to carry on. John felt the weight of those moments stretch out, stretching longer than he would have liked. But he didn't speak. He waited. Finally, Ryan found his voice. "Dad, I'm so sorry." His words came out shaky, weak, as though each one was a burden. "I know I've hurt you. I've hurt all of us, really. I don't even know where to begin." John didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. The silence between them was filled with years of unspoken emotions. The weight of it was heavy, pressing in on them both. Ryan looked down at the ground, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been living in a bubble of privilege, you know? For so long, I thought everything was fine. I thought I was doing the right thing, just trying to make Samantha happy. But I let her family, dictate everything. I let them tell me who I should be, what I should think, what I should want. And in doing that, I ignored the one person who mattered most. You." Ryan's voice cracked on the last word. He swallowed, fighting back tears, but they spilled over anyway, unchecked. He wiped his eyes, embarrassed, but still, he didn't stop. "I didn't realize what I was doing. I didn't realize the sacrifices you were making for us. You gave everything, Dad, and I just took it for granted." John stood still, his eyes never leaving Ryan. He had heard the words before, apologies, promises of change, but they had always felt empty. This time, though, there was something different about Ryan. He wasn't just apologizing because he was told to. He was admitting to the depth of his ignorance, his selfishness. But John knew that words weren't enough. They never had been. He took a step forward, his voice calm but firm. "Ryan, do you have any idea what you've done?" His words were measured, not out of anger, but out of the pain that had been buried for far too long. "Do you understand the damage that has been done? You and Samantha, you both used me, manipulated my love and generosity for your own convenience. You used me to build a life you didn't have to earn. And what's worse is you excluded me from that life. For years, I was just the guy who paid for everything, but never invited to the table." Ryan's face crumpled as John spoke. His hands gripped the back of a chair, as though the weight of his father's words was physically pushing him down. "I didn't know, Dad. I didn't see it. I was blind, and I'm sorry. I can't say it enough, but I truly am." John's heart clenched as he watched Ryan fall apart in front of him. For a moment, he felt a pang of sympathy. Ryan was his son, the boy he had raised, loved, and sacrificed for. It hurt to see him like this, but John knew that this wasn't the time for sympathy. Ryan had to face the full weight of what he had done. If there was any chance for them to rebuild, it had to start with that reckoning. "You didn't see it," John repeated, his voice still steady, though there was an edge to it. "That's the problem, Ryan. You didn't see it, and I let you. I let you think that what I was doing was just for you, just for your benefit. I let you keep taking without ever questioning it. And in doing so, I let you destroy our relationship. The love I gave you, the sacrifices I made, they weren't just financial. They were emotional. They were personal. And now, look where we are." Ryan wiped his face with the sleeve of his shirt, taking deep, shaky breaths. His shoulders heaved as he tried to speak again, but the words came out as nothing more than a broken sob. "I'm so sorry, Dad. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't deserve it. I need you to know that I see it now. I see how much I've hurt you. I see how much I've taken from you." John took another step forward, his eyes never leaving his son's face. He was trying to hold back the emotions that were rising within him. Anger, frustration, and yes, even a flicker of hope. But he had learned to guard himself over the years, and now was no different. "I know you're sorry, Ryan, but sorry doesn't undo the damage. Sorry doesn't erase the years I've spent feeling like a ghost in my own family. Sorry doesn't bring back the time I've wasted. the opportunities I missed, because I was too busy trying to be the good father, the good provider. Sorry doesn't give me back the dignity I lost when you chose to listen to someone else instead of me. Ryan's tears continued to fall, his face twisted in a mixture of guilt and sorrow. "What can I do, Dad?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "How do I fix this?" John closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the question sink in. He wasn't sure how to answer. Was it even possible to fix something this broken? Could they rebuild a relationship that had been built on lies, manipulation, and years of neglect? John didn't know the answer, but he did know one thing. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight. "You can start by proving to me that you're serious, Ryan," John said, his voice quiet but filled with conviction. "Prove to me that you can stand on your own 2 feet without leaning on me for financial support or approval. You want to make things right? Show me that you're capable of being the man you claim to be, the man I've always hoped you would be. And most importantly, prove that you're ready to rebuild our relationship, not because you need something from me, but because you genuinely want to." Ryan nodded slowly, his chest rising and falling as he fought to control his emotions. "I will, Dad. I promise. I'll do whatever it takes. I'll show you that I'm not the same person I was." John didn't respond immediately. He stood there, watching his son, waiting for something more, something deeper. Ryan's promise was a start, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. "I hope you mean it," John said quietly, finally breaking the silence. "But words aren't enough. I've spent too many years living on promises. It's time to show me that you're ready to live up to them." Ryan's head dropped in a mix of shame and determination. "I will. I will, Dad. I swear." John stood there for a moment longer, feeling the weight of the conversation settle in. The road ahead was uncertain, and the scars of the past wouldn't disappear overnight. But at least, for the first time in a long time, Ryan seemed to understand the depth of his mistakes. And maybe, just maybe, this could be the beginning of something new. As Ryan left John's house that evening, John stood by the door, watching him go. It wasn't the ending he had hoped for, nor the beginning of the reconciliation he dreamed of, but it was a start. And sometimes, that was all you could ask for. The journey wasn't over yet. But for the first time in years, John felt like he had finally taken the first step toward healing. The days following his conversation with Ryan were a mix of reflection and anticipation. John could feel the weight of the words he had spoken to his son still hanging in the air between them, but the uncertainty of what came next gnawed at him. The promise Ryan had made to change was sincere. He could see that. But John knew better than to believe in mere words anymore. Action was the only thing that could speak loud enough to cut through the years of broken promises and false hopes. John had been through too much, given too much of himself, to let another round of empty apologies take hold. This time there would be no easy forgiveness, no sweep-it-under-the-rug resolution. If Ryan truly wanted to restore their relationship, if he truly wanted to rebuild the trust that had been shattered, he would have to prove it. And John, for the first time in his life, was ready to let go of the past. Whether Ryan was ready to step into the future with him or not. It was a crisp Saturday morning when John stood by the window of his living room, looking out over the familiar view. The street was quiet, the houses lined up neatly in the distance, but John knew that peace, much like the landscape outside, was fleeting. There was a decision that had to be made, one that would determine the course of his future and his relationship with Ryan. John had decided it was time to set one final boundary, a line in the sand. He wouldn't wait around for change to happen. He would force the issue. He knew his son, and he knew that for Ryan to understand the gravity of what had been lost and what had been taken from him, he needed to face the consequences, not just for himself, but for the choices he had made. Ryan had been given so much, and now it was time for him to give something back. Responsibility. The doorbell rang, pulling John from his thoughts. He wasn't surprised. It had been 2 days since Ryan's last message. John had asked for space, for clarity, and now the time had come for the next step. When John opened the door, Ryan was standing there, looking uncertain but determined, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket. He was older now, his face drawn with the weight of what had transpired. But there was also something else, something John hadn't seen before, a recognition of his own failure, a quiet willingness to confront it. The Ryan standing on his doorstep was not the arrogant, self-assured man who had walked away from him months ago. This was a man who had been humbled by the truth. "I've been thinking a lot," Ryan said, his voice low, almost hesitant, "about what you said, about everything. And I know that I can't keep doing this. I can't keep letting the same mistakes control my life, control my choices." John said nothing, his expression hard but calm. He wasn't going to make this easy. Ryan needed to hear it. He needed to understand that the time for apologies was over. Now it was about action. Ryan swallowed, a nervous tick, betraying the quiet turmoil he was trying to hold back. "I want to fix this, Dad. I want to fix what I've broken. I know it's not going to be easy, but I'm willing to try. I need to try. Please." John stepped aside, silently motioning for Ryan to come in. As Ryan passed him, John closed the door behind them with a soft click. He wasn't sure why he felt a twinge of hope now, why this moment felt different from the countless others. Maybe it was because Ryan's words, even though they seemed filled with sincerity, still held that echo of uncertainty. "Sit down, Ryan," John said quietly, nodding to the chair across from him. His voice was calm, but there was a firmness behind it that could not be ignored. Ryan sat down, his eyes locked on John, the tension palpable in the room. John remained standing, his hands resting on the back of his chair, his gaze never wavering. "You want to fix this, Ryan?" John began slowly, his voice even. "Then here's the first thing you need to understand. You have to make a choice. This is the choice that will define who you are and who you become. You can't go back to the life you had before. You can't keep living in that bubble of privilege, making decisions based on convenience, based on what feels easy. The choices you make from now on, the man you choose to be, they need to be based on what's right." Ryan shifted in his seat, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What do you mean, Dad? I'm here, aren't I? I'm trying to take responsibility." "You're here, but you've been living your life based on what's comfortable, Ryan. You've made choices for years that put your family's happiness, your wife's happiness, above what was right, above what mattered, and you let me pay the price for that. Now you have to ask yourself, what kind of man do you want to be? A man who lets other people dictate his life, or a man who takes responsibility for his actions?" Ryan was quiet for a long moment, his hands gripping the armrests of the chair. He was thinking, really thinking, about the weight of his father's words. And for the first time in years, he seemed to grasp the full scope of what he had done. "I want to be someone who makes things right," Ryan said, his voice filled with a quiet determination. "But I know it's not going to be easy. I know that saying sorry isn't enough. I need to show you, show myself that I'm not the man I was. John nodded, his eyes never leaving Ryan's face. You're right. Sorry isn't enough, Ryan. And neither is just showing up and making promises. The real work starts now. This is where the reckoning happens. Ryan opened his mouth to speak, but John raised his hand to stop him. I'm not asking for forgiveness today, Ryan. I'm asking for you to prove to me and to yourself that you're ready to live a different way. It's time to show me, not with words, but with actions. The man you choose to be now is the man who will define the rest of your life. Ryan's face fell, a mix of shame and understanding in his eyes. I know, Dad. I know. I've been running away from this for too long. I thought I could just fix things with words. But I see now that it's more than that. I'm ready to change. I'm ready to be better. I know I have to earn your trust again. John took a slow breath, his posture stiff, but his heart steady. The silence between them felt heavier now, laden with the weight of the years they had spent apart. But there was something else there too, something that had been missing for a long time. Hope. You'll earn my trust, John said quietly. But it's not going to be easy, Ryan. It's going to take time. It's going to take work. And you're going to have to prove it every day from here on out. But I won't be your doormat anymore. I won't be the one you turn to when things get tough. If you want to rebuild this relationship, it starts with respect, with honesty, and with real responsibility. Ryan nodded, his face set with determination. I'll do whatever it takes, Dad. I know I've let you down, but I won't let you down again. John let out a breath, the weight on his shoulders easing slightly. Then show me. The conversation stretched into the evening, but by the time Ryan left, John knew something had shifted. Ryan's determination was real, but John also knew that change wouldn't come overnight. It would take time. There would be moments of doubt, moments where they both wondered if they could truly move past the hurt. But at least now there was a chance for both of them to rebuild. As John closed the door behind Ryan, he felt a sense of finality. The decision had been made. The past was now behind him, and he was stepping into a new chapter of his life. A chapter where he was no longer anyone's doormat. He walked to the window, gazing out at the quiet street. It was a new day, a new beginning, and for the first time in a long time, John felt ready to face whatever came next. The weeks that followed the confrontation at Christmas were long, drawn out, and heavy. The silence that descended between John and his family felt like a weight in the air, suffocating and constant. After years of giving, sacrificing, and being emotionally invested in the lives of others, John had finally drawn a line in the sand. And now, as the weeks passed, that line remained untouched, unspoken, but firm. Ryan's calls became more frequent, each message more urgent than the last. "Dad, I need to talk," his voice would say, the desperation in his tone impossible to ignore. But John ignored it. He let the phone ring out each time. He could hear the remorse in Ryan's voice, the guilt, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't nearly enough to erase the years of emotional neglect, the years of being used as a resource rather than a father. John had already made his decision, and he wasn't going to let guilt or the emotional pleas change it. Samantha's messages flooded in with the same urgency, but with a different tone. They were apologetic, often accompanied by a promise to change, to make things right. But John had heard it all before. Words were cheap. Actions spoke louder than any apology ever could. And until they showed him real change, John was no longer listening. At first, there had been a sense of guilt in John's heart. Was he being too harsh? Was he really justified in cutting them off completely? But each day that passed without a single call answered, without a single text replied to, John felt that guilt begin to slip away. It was replaced by something stronger: clarity. He didn't need to keep sacrificing his peace of mind for the sake of people who had used him for years. It was time to focus on himself. John started small. The house had fallen into disrepair over the years, as he had always prioritized the needs of Ryan and Samantha over his own. The furniture was old, worn down by time and use. The walls needed a fresh coat of paint. The garden in the backyard, once lovingly tended, had become overgrown and neglected. John had never minded. It had always felt like there was something more important to do. But now, with the time to finally reflect, he realized how much he had neglected the place that should have been his sanctuary. The first change came when he replaced the worn-out couch in the living room. For years, it had been a hand-me-down, a piece of furniture that had no real meaning except for its practicality. But John didn't need practicality anymore. He needed something that felt like home to him, something that reflected his own taste and needs, not the needs of others. He spent time carefully choosing new furniture, comfortable, sturdy, and simple, no designer labels, no unnecessary flair, just pieces that suited him, that made him feel at ease in his own space. It was a small change, but it felt monumental. Next, he tackled the kitchen, where the countertops had been cluttered with old appliances that he had bought for Samantha's convenience. The walls were cracked, the cabinets outdated, the space too small for what it had become. John had always sacrificed his own desires for their comfort, always pushing his own needs aside. But now he was ready to take the space back for himself. He replaced the outdated appliances with new, sleek versions that were practical, yet more in tune with his own style. He installed shelves for his own hobbies, books, photography, things that made him feel alive, that he hadn't had time for in years. The kitchen, which had once been a space where he felt like a silent servant, was now a place where he could enjoy cooking for himself on his own terms. But it wasn't just about the house. John had spent so much of his life taking care of everyone else that he had never taken the time to care for himself. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to do something he had always wanted. He booked a vacation. John had always avoided taking time off. He had convinced himself that he was too busy or that he couldn't afford to take a break. But now, with the financial freedom he had regained and the clarity of mind that came from standing firm, he realized how much he needed this. He needed to reconnect with himself, to find the joy in life that he had lost somewhere along the way. He booked a trip to a quiet beach resort, somewhere secluded where he could spend his days in peace. No phone calls, no obligations, no people demanding his attention. Just the sound of the ocean and the warmth of the sun. It wasn't extravagant, but it was everything he needed. As he walked through the airport, feeling the weight of his luggage and the uncertainty of what lay ahead, John couldn't help but think about Maria. She had always been the one to encourage him to take time for himself, to rest, to recharge. But for so many years, he had put those dreams aside. He had thought that his worth was tied to his ability to give, whether it was money, time, or love. He had never realized how much he had forgotten to give to himself. The beach was everything he had hoped for. The quietness of the waves, the soft golden sand, the breeze that carried the scent of salt and freedom. It all soothed something inside of him that he hadn't realized had been aching. One morning, as he sat on the beach with a book in hand, he allowed himself to just be. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the pull of guilt, didn't feel the constant weight of responsibility that had been with him for so long. There were no calls from Ryan, no messages from Samantha. There was just the sound of the ocean and the warmth of the sun on his skin. As he closed his eyes, he thought about Maria. He thought about the life they had built together, the quiet evenings, the laughter, the love. There had been challenges, yes, but there had always been a sense of balance, a sense of respect and partnership that had made their life meaningful. And then, as he thought about it, John realized something. He had spent so many years looking outward, toward his son, toward Samantha, toward everyone else, that he had lost sight of what truly mattered. His love for them had been real, but he had let them take advantage of it. Now, for the first time, he could look inward. He could reflect on the years he had spent giving and sacrificing, and he could finally forgive himself for not taking care of his own needs. The trip was a turning point for John. It wasn't just a vacation, it was a rediscovery of himself. He came back feeling lighter, more at peace with the choices he had made. He had put in the work to rebuild his life, not just his home, but himself. He was no longer the man who had been a doormat, who had let others walk all over him. He was a man who knew what he wanted, what he needed, and what he deserved. When he returned home, the silence that had hung over him for so long didn't feel as oppressive. It felt like a welcome change. Ryan still hadn't called, but John wasn't focused on waiting anymore. He had done the work, and now he was ready to live his life on his own terms. For the first time in years, John felt free. He had finally closed the door on the past and opened a new one that was all his own. It was a crisp morning in early March when John sat by his kitchen window, savoring the quiet of the day. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a soft glow over the backyard, where the garden he had once tended so carefully was beginning to show signs of life again. After years of neglect, it was slowly coming back to life, much like John himself. He sat back in his chair, sipping his coffee, enjoying the warmth of the mug in his hands. It had been a few months since his last encounter with Ryan, and the silence between them had been both peaceful and unsettling. John had taken the time to focus on himself, to rebuild his life, and to enjoy the independence he had fought so hard to regain. But the silence had also given him space to reflect on what had been lost, what had been broken, and what still needed to be healed. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was a letter, not an email or a text, but a physical letter. Something about the old-fashioned nature of it felt odd to him, as if the letter was a sign that something important was about to happen. The envelope was simple, addressed in Ryan's handwriting, the ink a little shaky, as if written with urgency. There was no return address, just Ryan's name, written with a sort of desperation that caught John's attention. With a sigh, John set his coffee down and opened the envelope. He unfolded the letter slowly, as if he already knew that the words inside would weigh on him. And they did. Dear Dad, I know it's been a long time since we've talked, and I know that the last time we spoke, I left you with nothing but hurt and disappointment. I want to start by saying that I understand why you did what you did, and I get it now. I didn't see it then, but I see it now, and I'm sorry. I've been struggling without you in my life, and I've been trying to find my way. But it's been harder than I ever thought it would be. I can't do this without you. I realize that now. I've made so many mistakes, and I know I don't deserve to ask this of you, but I don't know where else to turn. Samantha and I are facing the very real possibility of losing our home. The foreclosure is looming, and I feel like everything is slipping away from me. I don't know how I got here, but I know it's because I didn't listen to you. I didn't understand what you were doing, why you kept giving and giving without ever asking for anything in return. And I took it all for granted. But I'm ready to make things right. If you can help me now, I promise that I will change. I will not let Samantha and her family control our lives anymore. I will work harder than I've ever worked before. I won't keep making the same mistakes. I will do everything I can to rebuild our relationship, and I won't take you for granted again. I know that this is a lot to ask. I know I've hurt you, and I don't expect you to just forgive me. But I need your help, Dad. I need you. I can't do this without you. Please, I know I've let you down, but I'm asking you one last time. Will you help me? Love, Ryan. John sat back in his chair, his hand gripping the letter tightly. It was a lot to absorb all at once, and his mind was immediately flooded with conflicting emotions. On one hand, Ryan's words were sincere. He could feel the weight of his son's desperation, the rawness of his plea for help. It was a far cry from the arrogant, entitled man he had once been. But on the other hand, John knew that this wasn't just about the money. It couldn't be. The years of manipulation, the way Ryan and Samantha had taken advantage of his generosity, were still fresh in his mind. John couldn't just sweep that under the rug. He had spent too many years being the one who gave and gave, only to be used as a financial tool, a source of endless support, without ever receiving the respect or love he deserved. But there was something else in Ryan's letter that caught John's attention. It wasn't just the apology. It wasn't just the promise to change. It was the admission that Ryan felt helpless without his guidance. It was the vulnerability in Ryan's words, the rawness of his acknowledgement that he had been wrong. This was different from the usual promises John had heard in the past. It felt real. The phone buzzed again, interrupting John's thoughts. It was another message from Ryan. Dad, I know you're probably reading the letter now. I'm sorry to keep texting, but I just wanted to let you know how much this means to me. I don't expect you to fix everything, and I know I've made a mess of things. But if you can help me, if you can give me one more chance, I promise I'll work hard to earn your trust again. I just need a chance. John exhaled deeply, setting the phone down on the table. The weight of Ryan's plea hung heavily in the air, and for the first time in a long while, John was uncertain. He knew that Ryan's situation was dire, that the foreclosure was real, and that his son needed help. But John also knew that this wasn't just about money. It was about respect, about boundaries, and about whether Ryan was truly ready to take responsibility for his actions. John had made it clear the last time they spoke that he wouldn't just be a safety net anymore. If he was going to help Ryan, it would have to be on different terms, terms that didn't involve enabling Ryan's poor decisions. The respect John demanded wasn't just for himself, it was for the principle of personal responsibility. Ryan had to learn that he could no longer rely on his father to fix everything for him. After a few hours of silent reflection, John stood up from his chair and walked to the window. He looked out at the yard, the same yard he had spent years maintaining for his family, the same yard that had witnessed the ups and downs of his life. The quiet of the morning felt like a pause in time, and John knew that this moment was critical. He couldn't make the decision right away. He needed more time to think. But deep down, he knew that whatever decision he made, it would define the next chapter of his life. This wasn't just about Ryan, it was about John, too. He had spent years in a cycle of giving, sacrificing, and enabling, and now he had to choose whether he would continue in that cycle or break free from it. John walked to the kitchen, his hands steady as he poured himself another cup of coffee. He sat back down at the table, staring at Ryan's letter once more. The decision was both simpler and more complex than he had imagined. The next few days were filled with contemplation, as John considered the options laid before him. Should he help Ryan again? Should he give him that last chance? Or was it time to let go completely and walk away from the broken relationship, knowing that Ryan might never change? The decision was made 2 days later. John sat at his desk, a fresh cup of coffee beside him, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. It was time to write. He began typing slowly, carefully, considering every word. The letter he was writing would be a turning point. It would be a response to Ryan's plea, and it would set the terms for whatever came next. Dear Ryan, I've spent a lot of time thinking about your letter, and I can see the sincerity in your words. I hear the desperation in your voice, and I know you've come to realize how much you've taken for granted. But the reality is this: I cannot just be the person you turn to whenever things get tough. I cannot keep enabling you, and I cannot keep giving without seeing real change. That said, I am willing to help you. But it must be under one condition. You must prove to me, not with words, but with actions, that you're ready to take responsibility for your life. I can no longer be your safety net. You have to show me that you're capable of standing on your own 2 feet, that you're ready to make the hard choices for yourself and not rely on the comfort of others to fix your problems. I will help you this one last time, Ryan, but this is not a loan. It is not a handout. It is a chance for you to rebuild your life, and it starts with you taking ownership of your decisions, both past and future. I am not asking for anything more than your respect and your honesty. If you're truly ready to change, to be the man you've promised to be, then I will be here for you. But I will not be the one who carries you any longer. You need to be the one to take that first step. Love, Dad. John read the letter over and over, making sure it said everything he needed to say. It was firm, but it was fair. He wasn't just offering help, he was offering the possibility of redemption, but only if Ryan was truly willing to work for it. This time, John would not be the one to carry the weight. Ryan had to choose, and this letter was his final chance to prove that he was ready to make the right decisions. John sealed the letter, and for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace with his choice. The days after sending the letter were long and filled with restless thought. John sat in his chair each morning, sipping his coffee in the quiet solitude of his home, but his mind never truly rested. The letter he had written to Ryan weighed heavily on him, as did the decision he had made. He had laid out the conditions, set the boundaries, and written down everything he needed to say. But now, with the silence between them thick and pressing, he wasn't sure if he had made the right call. His instincts told him to remain firm. He had spent years trying to fix Ryan's mistakes, smoothing over his failures, picking up the pieces of a life Ryan hadn't been able to handle on his own. And every time John gave, he had been pushed farther into the shadows. No more. He couldn't keep falling into the same patterns. He couldn't go back to being the bank, the emotional cushion, or the safety net. He had given everything, money, time, energy, and had received nothing in return but resentment and neglect. Yet, as the days wore on, John found himself looking at the letter again and again, rereading Ryan's words, feeling that familiar tug of fatherly love. It was a love complicated by disappointment, but it was there. John wanted to believe that Ryan had changed, that this time, this one time, things would be different. In his heart, John felt a conflict that gnawed at him. His wife, Maria, had always been the gentle voice of reason, reminding him that family comes first. Her soft smile and her insistence that forgiveness was key had been guiding principles in their marriage. Even in her final days, when things were difficult and money was tight, Maria had always said, "No matter what happens, we are family. We must help each other." But now, in the quiet solitude of his home, John wondered if he was doing the right thing. Was he being too harsh? Was he being unfair to Ryan, whose life had become a series of bad choices, each one stacking higher than the last? The temptation to help Ryan, to be there for him as he once had been, was strong. It was natural for John to want to fix things, to be the father he had always been. But John knew that deep down this would not do either of them any good. Helping Ryan without real change, without a shift in behavior, attitude, and responsibility, would only keep the cycle of enabling alive. And John knew, deep in his bones, that it would do far more harm than good in the long run. John spent the next few days in a fog of indecision. He cleaned the house, worked on small projects that had been neglected for years, and kept himself busy, trying to distract himself from the decision that loomed over him like a cloud. He kept replaying the conversations he had had with Ryan, the conversations with Maria that had now become a faint whisper in his memory. He kept coming back to one question. What was best for Ryan? Was it enough to just tell him no and walk away? Would Ryan learn? Would he grow if John simply kept his distance and held firm to his boundaries? Or would that drive a wedge between them, a wedge that would never heal? On the fifth day after sending the letter, John sat at his kitchen table, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee. He had checked his phone earlier, but there had been no response from Ryan. No text, no voicemail. And that was okay. He had made it clear that he wasn't going to make this easy for his son. But now, John's resolve was beginning to waver. What if Ryan had finally seen the light? What if he was ready to change, to take responsibility? A knock on the door broke John's thoughts. His heart skipped a beat. He had been expecting this moment. He wasn't sure if it was because he was finally ready or if he had simply been waiting for Ryan to make the first move. John stood up and walked to the door slowly, his mind spinning with possibilities. He opened it to find Ryan standing on the doorstep, his face drawn and weary, but also holding something else, something that John couldn't quite put his finger on. Ryan wasn't looking at the floor as he had before. He wasn't nervous or avoiding John's eyes. No, this time Ryan was looking at him, directly at him, and there was a quiet determination in his expression. "Dad," Ryan said softly, his voice thick with emotion, "I've been thinking about what you said, about everything you wrote in the letter. I know it's not enough to just say, 'I'm sorry.' I know I've messed up, and I know I can't keep asking you to fix my problems, but I'm ready to take responsibility. I'm ready to change." John's chest tightened at the words. He had waited for this moment, but hearing it, actually hearing Ryan say it, made everything feel more real than ever. But even as the familiar pang of hope stirred in him, John remembered his promise to himself. Words were no longer enough. This time Ryan had to prove it, not with more promises, but with actions. John didn't respond immediately. He stood there for a long moment, studying his son's face. Ryan's eyes were clear, but his face was weary, as if he had been carrying a heavy burden for a long time. The apology was there, but John wasn't looking for apologies anymore. "You've come here for one reason, Ryan," John said, his voice steady but firm. "And that's to ask for my help. And I'm going to give you an answer. But before I do, I need to make something very clear. If you want my help, you have to prove it. Not with words, not with promises, but with your actions." Ryan's face flickered with a mix of confusion and anticipation. "What do you mean?" he asked. John stepped aside, motioning for Ryan to come in. "Come sit down. I've got something to say." Ryan walked into the house, his footsteps hesitant but resolute. As he sat down, John leaned against the table, crossing his arms. The silence between them was heavy, and John could feel the tension in the air. This was the moment where everything would shift one way or the other. He couldn't back down now. "Ryan," John began, his voice calm but piercing, "you've been given every chance in the world. I've helped you time and again, and each time it's been the same. You've relied on me to bail you out. But that ends today. I can't keep doing this for you. I can't keep enabling your decisions, and I can't keep letting you rely on me to fix everything. You've got to take responsibility for your life now. If you want to rebuild this relationship with me, if you want to earn my trust back, you have to show me that you can stand on your own 2 feet." Ryan's brow furrowed, and he opened his mouth to speak, but John raised his hand to stop him. "Listen carefully," John continued. "I will help you, but only if you're serious about making real changes. I won't be your fallback anymore. No more handouts, no more empty promises. You've got to prove it with your actions. You have to show me that you're ready to work for what you want, that you're ready to take responsibility for the mess you've made and stop depending on others to clean it up for you." Ryan's eyes searched John's face, and for the first time in a long while, John saw the vulnerability in his son's gaze. It wasn't the prideful, entitled look that had once irritated him. It was the look of someone who had finally realized the weight of their own choices. "I understand," Ryan said quietly. "I do. I won't ask you for any more help until I've shown you that I can handle this on my own. I promise. I'll prove it to you." John studied him for a long moment, the weight of the words lingering between them. Then, finally, he nodded. "Good. This is the last chance I'm giving you, Ryan. But I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. You'll have to prove yourself, but I'm willing to see if you can do it. Just remember, this is your choice now. I'm not going to carry you anymore." Ryan nodded, his face a mixture of relief and determination. "Thank you, Dad. I won't let you down." John turned away from him, walking towards the window. The silence in the room was profound, and for the first time in a long time, John felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The decision had been made. He had set the terms, and now it was up to Ryan to follow through. He didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time in years, he felt a sense of clarity. He had made the right choice, and now it was time for Ryan to prove that he was ready to take responsibility for his own life. The days following John's decision to help Ryan felt both like a release and a burden. John had set the terms, and now the hard part was up to Ryan. He had given his son the opportunity to prove himself, but John knew that this journey would be neither easy nor quick. There would be no magic fix to the years of mistakes, and Ryan would have to work harder than he ever had before to earn back the trust he had broken. Ryan had agreed to John's terms, but the road ahead was still unclear. The first step toward redemption, according to John's conditions, was for Ryan to face the consequences of his actions, starting with their home. The house, once a symbol of their supposed success, now represented everything that was wrong with their lives. It was a constant reminder of their financial irresponsibility, the debt that had nearly ruined them both, and the prideful life they had tried to live. Ryan sat on the couch, the letter from John still fresh in his mind. He had agreed to the terms, but now came the hard part. The house. He never imagined he would have to sell it. The house that had been their dream home, the one he had worked so hard to secure. But that dream had turned into a nightmare. The mortgage payments were suffocating them, and the debt had piled up so high that the walls seemed to close in with every passing month. Samantha had always loved the house, always insisted it was the only way to live. But now, in the wake of the confrontation, Ryan knew that the house had to go. Samantha was less than thrilled with the idea. She had grown accustomed to the lifestyle the house represented: luxury, comfort, a sense of security in the things that money could buy. But even she couldn't deny the looming threat of foreclosure, the crushing pressure of debts they couldn't afford. Ryan sat her down one evening, his voice shaking with the weight of the decision he was about to make. "We have to sell it, Sam," Ryan said, his voice firm but tinged with the uncertainty that had followed him for years. "We can't keep living like this. I've made mistakes and I need to fix them. If we're ever going to move forward, we have to let go of this house. It's the first step." Samantha stared at him, her expression unreadable. For a long time she didn't speak. Finally she sighed, her eyes softening, just a little. "I don't want to lose it, Ryan. This house, it's everything we've worked for, everything I've dreamed of." "I know," Ryan replied, his voice softer now. "But we can't keep living in a house we can't afford. It's tearing us apart. It's time for us to be real with ourselves. We can't keep pretending." There was a long silence before Samantha finally nodded, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Okay, but this is going to be hard." Ryan reached out and took her hand, squeezing it tightly. "I know, but we'll get through it. We'll do this together." Over the next few months, the process of selling the house began. It wasn't easy. There were repairs to be made, staging to be done, and a flood of emotions to sort through as they packed up their things. Ryan felt a deep sense of shame with each box he packed, each picture he took off the wall. It was a stark reminder of everything they had tried to build, everything they had failed to maintain. The reality of their financial situation began to hit home for Ryan. They were not the successful couple they had once imagined themselves to be. The house was their biggest symbol of success, and now it was being sold to pay off debts, to regain control of their future. But as hard as it was, Ryan understood now. For the first time, he understood the weight of the choices he had made. The house was a symbol of the arrogance and entitlement he had once felt. It was a symbol of a life built on the idea of having more, always more, without understanding the cost of it all. Selling the house wasn't just about the money. It was about letting go of the false ideals that had driven him. John stayed distant during the process, offering advice when asked, but for the most part, keeping a hands-off approach. He had made it clear to Ryan that this was his responsibility. John would support him, but Ryan had to take the lead. This was Ryan's journey now, and John was no longer going to carry the weight for him. As the moving trucks arrived to take their things, John felt a strange mix of emotions. There was a small tentative pride in how Ryan was handling the situation. He wasn't fighting it anymore. He wasn't pushing back against the reality of their choices. But there was also the lingering doubt, the fear that Ryan would slip back into old habits once the dust settled. For the first time in years, John felt like he could breathe. There was a chance, just a small chance, that Ryan would make it, that he would rise above his past mistakes and take responsibility for his future. But that chance was still fragile, and John wasn't sure if it was enough to rebuild their relationship, if it was enough to make up for everything that had been lost. The transition to a smaller, more modest house was humbling for both Ryan and Samantha. The space was smaller, the neighborhood quieter, and the house itself felt like a far cry from the one they had once dreamed of. But for Ryan, it was a wake-up call. Each small, humbling step, the decisions about what to keep, what to give away, what to let go, taught him something about what it meant to live within his means. He found himself working late into the night at a second job, something he had never done before. He took on additional freelance work to make ends meet, staying up long hours to make sure his family had enough. Samantha, too, had to adjust. It wasn't easy, and there were many arguments along the way, but she began to understand that their lives had to change. Ryan had made the decision to take responsibility, and now it was time for her to join him in that effort. Through it all, Ryan began to see the depth of his father's sacrifices. John had always been there, working tirelessly to support his family, never asking for anything in return. Ryan saw the love his father had poured into him, not just financially, but emotionally and spiritually. For years, Ryan had taken that love for granted, assuming it would always be there, that his father's sacrifices were endless. But now, as he worked harder than ever to support his own family, he began to understand the weight of what it had cost John. One evening, after a long day of work, Ryan sat down to dinner with Samantha. The house was small, simple, and modest, but it was theirs. And for the first time in a long time, Ryan felt a sense of peace. It wasn't the grand house they had once dreamed of, but it was real. It was theirs, built on their own efforts, not on a mountain of debt and borrowed time. As they ate, Ryan looked across the table at Samantha, his eyes reflecting the exhaustion of the last few months. "I think I finally get it, Sam," he said quietly. "I finally understand what Dad was trying to do all along. It wasn't about the house or the money. It was about building something real, something lasting. And I've spent so much time trying to build a life based on things that didn't matter." Samantha looked up at him, her expression softening. "I've been thinking the same thing," she said. This is what we've been missing. Real responsibility, real effort. We're doing this together, Ryan. We're starting fresh." Ryan nodded, feeling the weight of the last few months lift just a little. He wasn't all the way there yet. There were still challenges ahead. But for the first time in his life, he felt like he was finally on the right path. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered, his father's voice, telling him that he had taken the first step toward redemption. The months following their move into a more modest home passed by in a blur of hard work and adjustment. Ryan and Samantha had not only downsized their lifestyle, but they had also begun to rebuild the emotional and relational foundation that had been crumbling for years. It was a slow process, but they were committed. The changes were not immediate, nor were they easy, but they were real. Ryan had taken a second job to support his family, working long hours and sometimes even taking odd jobs on the weekends. His pride, once inflated by arrogance, had been deflated by necessity. Samantha, too, had to adjust her mindset, learning to live within their means and accepting the reality of their situation. Counseling had become a regular part of their routine. At first, it felt awkward, forced even, but over time the sessions helped them confront their issues. Issues that went far beyond their finances. They began to see the cracks in their marriage and the ways in which they had both contributed to their financial downfall. But as hard as it was, the counseling was working. John, ever the skeptic, watched from the sidelines. He had offered support, but never more than what was strictly necessary. He had learned long ago that offering too much help meant enabling bad habits. So he kept his distance, offering guidance when asked, but never pushing too hard. He couldn't fully trust that Ryan had changed. Not yet. The past had left scars too deep, and it would take more than a few months to undo a lifetime of mistakes. Still, there were moments that gave John hope. Ryan had been steady in his work. He wasn't running from his responsibilities anymore. And as John saw him slowly taking control of his life, a small, cautious part of him began to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, things might finally be different. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, Ryan stood in front of John's door. His hand was raised, hesitating before knocking. He had been here before so many times, knocking on his father's door, pleading for help or forgiveness. But this time felt different. This time he wasn't asking for a handout. He wasn't asking for his father to fix things. John, sitting in his recliner, heard the knock. The house was quieter these days, more peaceful. He had spent the evening alone, reflecting on his own life and how much had changed. He wasn't sure if it was the right time to let Ryan in, but something told him that tonight was different. He stood up, walked over to the door, and opened it. "Hey, Dad," Ryan said, his voice quiet but firm. His face looked older, more worn, and there was a tiredness in his eyes. But there was something else there too, a new maturity that John had never seen before. John nodded, stepping aside to let his son in. "Come on in, Ryan," he said, his voice calm but unsure. "It's been a while." As Ryan stepped inside, he glanced around, taking in the simple, modest decor of John's home. The house, much like its owner, had aged well, its warmth not found in its size or luxury, but in the memories, in the quiet comfort of time well spent. John motioned for Ryan to sit, and they both took their usual places in the living room, John in his recliner and Ryan on the couch, just a few feet away. The silence between them was heavier than either of them anticipated. Ryan shifted in his seat, the weight of what he was about to say settling on his shoulders. For a moment, he didn't know how to begin. The words he had rehearsed so many times seemed inadequate now. "I'm sorry, Dad," Ryan said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know I've apologized before, but it's not enough. I've taken you for granted for so long. I've been selfish, arrogant, and I've hurt you in ways I can't even begin to express. I didn't see what I was doing to you, to our family, and now I realize that I've been the one holding us back all these years." John's eyes softened as he looked at his son, his face showing no sign of the skepticism he had carried for so long. Ryan's apology wasn't just words this time. It was accompanied by something deeper, something more genuine. There was a vulnerability in his son's eyes that John had never seen before, and it made his heart ache. "I can't tell you how much I've been struggling," Ryan continued, his voice breaking. "I'm not just sorry for the things I did. I'm sorry for the way I treated you. For years, I pushed you away. I didn't want to listen, but now I wish I had listened sooner. You were right all along, and I didn't see it." John let the silence hang in the air for a moment, allowing Ryan to speak, to let out the guilt he had carried. He was still hesitant, still unsure of where this conversation would lead, but there was a part of him, a small part, that felt a flicker of hope. Ryan's voice dropped to a whisper. "I'm proud of myself for the first time in a long time, Dad. Not because I'm succeeding financially or because I've made more money, but because I've started to understand what it means to work hard, to earn respect. Not just from other people, but from myself. I'm finally getting it." John sat back in his chair, his hands resting on the armrests as he listened. The words Ryan spoke were hard for him to hear, but they were the words he had longed to hear for so many years. There was a tenderness in Ryan's voice now that John had never encountered before. For the first time, John felt like he wasn't alone in this, like Ryan was finally stepping up to the plate, ready to take responsibility for his life. Ryan shifted in his seat, his eyes never leaving his father's. "I know it's been a long time since we've really talked. I know I've shut you out for years, but I want you to know that I'm different now. I'm not the same person who walked out of here all those times. I've learned the hard way, Dad, and I'm willing to keep learning. I'm not asking for your forgiveness right away, but I need you to know how much I've changed." John took a deep breath, his chest tight with emotion. He had heard Ryan say these things before, but this time felt different. It wasn't just the apology, it was the sincerity behind it. There was no pretense, no defense, no excuses, just raw honesty. "You've got a lot of work to do, Ryan," John said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "But for the first time in a long time, I think you're on the right path. And that's something to be proud of. But I'm not just going to forgive you overnight. It's going to take time. You've hurt me, and you've hurt yourself. But I'm willing to see if you can keep going down this path." Ryan nodded, his eyes bright with tears. "I understand, Dad, and I'm willing to put in the work. I know I don't deserve your trust, but I'll work every day to earn it." The room was silent for a moment, both of them caught in the weight of the words that had been spoken. For the first time, it felt like something had shifted between them. The tension that had hung in the air for so long was beginning to lift. And as they sat there, John realized that the small glimmer of hope he had felt was growing. Maybe, just maybe, Ryan was ready to change. The conversation lasted for hours. They talked about the past, the mistakes, the regrets, the missed opportunities, and they talked about the future. For the first time in years, John felt like he was truly talking to his son again. It wasn't easy. There were moments of discomfort, moments where the old wounds threatened to resurface, but for the first time in a long time, there was real communication. There was understanding, and there was the beginning of trust. By the time Ryan left that evening, the sun had set, and the air outside was crisp and cool. John watched his son leave with a sense of calm he hadn't known in years. It wasn't a complete resolution, but it was a step forward, a real step. As he closed the door and sat back down in his chair, John let out a deep breath. It was the beginning of something new. The foundations of their relationship had been shattered, but for the first time, they were starting to rebuild together. As the year drew to a close, John sat by his window, watching the first snowflakes of winter swirl down from the sky. The neighborhood looked peaceful, the houses adorned with holiday lights, and the sound of children laughing and playing outside filled the air. It was the kind of quiet evening he had always longed for, yet never truly experienced. The weight of the past year had been lifted, and with it, A new sense of peace had settled in John's heart. Things had changed, dramatically so. For the first time in years, John felt a sense of calm. He was no longer tethered to the expectations of others. He had spent so much of his life trying to be everything for everyone, from providing financially to being the emotional support his family leaned on. Now he had begun to prioritize his own needs. He had learned the value of solitude, not as something to be feared, but as something that allowed him to reconnect with himself. He had spent months rebuilding his life, brick by brick. He had repaired his home, created a space that felt like his own, and even taken time to make new friends. His neighbors, once distant figures who had admired him from afar but never truly understood him, began to notice the change. There was something different about John now. He was no longer the broken man they had known. He was not the man who had given everything to his family only to be left behind. He was a man who had found his voice, who had learned to stand up for himself and prioritize his own well-being. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. John had finally stopped apologizing for being himself, and for the first time, he realized that he was enough, just as he was. Ryan, too, had made significant progress. Though the road had not been easy and his small business was still struggling, he had dedicated himself to making it work. The business wasn't thriving yet, but Ryan had found something he had never truly known before: purpose. He was working long hours, learning the ins and outs of running a company, handling finances, and making decisions that would directly impact his future. It was challenging, and there were days when the weight of it all threatened to overwhelm him, but he was determined to keep going. John continued to support Ryan emotionally, but now it was different. He wasn't the financial crutch he had once been. Instead, John had become more of a mentor, someone Ryan could turn to for guidance when needed. John had made it clear that he wouldn't be helping him financially anymore, and Ryan, though reluctant at first, had accepted that reality. He had learned that he could no longer rely on his father to fix his mistakes. The money John had given him over the years had never been the answer. The answer was in taking responsibility and finding the strength within himself to build a life of his own. Ryan had even begun attending local networking events, trying to connect with other small business owners, and slowly, the pieces began to fall into place. It wasn't perfect, and there were still a lot of rough days ahead, but for the first time in his life, Ryan felt in control of his own future. He wasn't waiting for someone else to bail him out. He was making his own decisions, and he was willing to live with the consequences, good or bad. As the new year approached, John found himself reflecting on the year gone by, the lessons learned, and the changes that had occurred. His life had been filled with pain, disappointment, and sacrifice, but it had also been filled with growth, healing, and newfound strength. He had learned the hard way that self-respect was the foundation of everything else, something he had never truly understood until now. The silence between him and Ryan, once so heavy and filled with anger and resentment, had been replaced with something else: understanding. Their relationship was still a work in progress, but it was better than it had ever been. Ryan had proven that he was willing to change, and John, though cautious, had begun to trust him again. On New Year's Eve, John sat alone in his living room, a glass of whiskey in hand, watching the clock tick down toward midnight. He had no grand celebrations or parties to attend. He had no big plans or resolutions for the new year. He didn't need them. What he had now was more than he had ever imagined. He had peace. He had control over his life. And for the first time in years, he felt like he was living for himself, not for anyone else, not for anyone's expectations, but for himself. Just before midnight, John's phone rang. It was Ryan. "Hey, Dad," Ryan's voice came through the speaker, sounding a little nervous but also a little hopeful. "I just wanted to wish you a happy new year. I know it's been a crazy year, but I'm grateful for everything. I'm really trying to make things work with the business. And I wanted to thank you for giving me a chance to prove myself. It's been hard, but I'm doing it. I'm really doing it." John smiled softly, leaning back in his chair as he held the phone to his ear. "I'm proud of you, Ryan. You've come a long way. Keep going. You're doing the right thing." Ryan's voice cracked slightly, and for a moment, John could hear the vulnerability in it, the vulnerability that had once been buried under layers of pride and arrogance. "I know I've messed up, and I know I've hurt you, but I'm not going to let you down again. I just wanted to say thank you for giving me a chance to do things the right way." "Nayo," John paused, the weight of Ryan's words sinking in. The years of disappointment, the struggles, the pain, it all felt lighter now. The past would never fully disappear, but it no longer controlled him. "Happy New Year, son," John said quietly, his voice filled with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. "Let's make this one count." As the clock struck midnight, John raised his glass in a small toast to the new year. He had made it through the storm, and while he knew the road ahead would still have its challenges, he also knew he was no longer the man he had been, the man who had lost himself in others' expectations, the man who had put everyone's needs ahead of his own. John was a new man, a man who had found his voice, his peace, and most importantly, his self-respect. And as the fireworks exploded outside, marking the beginning of the new year, John felt that for the first time in a long time, he was truly free. The new year had arrived, and with it, a new beginning for both John and Ryan. They had both faced their pasts, made their peace, and now they could look forward to building something better. John's quiet hope for the future, tempered by the lessons of the past, felt like the foundation of something real, something lasting. Ryan's transformation was still in progress, but John knew that as long as his son kept fighting, kept working, they would get there. Together, they would forge new paths. But for now, John was content. He was content in the silence of his home, in the simplicity of his life, and in the knowledge that he had finally taken control of his own destiny. The past was behind him. The future was wide open. And for the first time in a long time, John was ready to embrace whatever came next. As the days of winter gave way to the promise of spring, John stood in front of his mirror, adjusting his jacket. The reflection staring back at him was not the same man who had walked through life in the shadow of others' expectations. He wasn't the man who had let his love for his family blind him to the reality of his own worth. No, this man was different. He stood a little taller now, a little more certain of himself. He had finally found his way, not just out of the darkness of his past, but into the light of understanding. Today, John was going to a family reunion with Ryan. It wasn't just any reunion. It was an opportunity for John to embrace what he had struggled to define for so many years, the true meaning of family. He had often thought of family as a bond formed by blood, by shared history, by the years spent together. But over the course of his journey, John had come to realize that family was something far more complex. It wasn't about proximity or history. It was about respect, love, and mutual support. The drive to the reunion was a quiet one. Ryan, sitting in the passenger seat, had become someone John could talk to again. They had been through so much together, the pain of the past, the hard lessons learned, and now they were both moving forward, cautiously but steadily. "Dad," Ryan said, his voice breaking the silence, "I'm really glad you're coming with me today. I know it's not the easiest thing, but I think this is going to be good for us." John glanced at his son, nodding slowly. "I think it will be good for me too. You've come a long way, Ryan. I'm proud of you." Ryan smiled, a smile that wasn't forced or weighed down by guilt. For the first time in a long time, Ryan seemed like the man John had always hoped he would become. The drive took them out of town, into the quiet countryside where the reunion was being held. It was a small gathering, a collection of friends and extended family, many of whom John had never met before. As they pulled up to the venue, Ryan turned to his father. "You don't have to stay for long if it's too much, but I think you'll like it. These people, they're not like what we've had before. They care about you, Dad. They don't have any expectations, just respect." John took a deep breath, his heart beating a little faster. He wasn't sure what to expect. He had always believed that family was about shared experiences, but after everything that had happened, he wasn't sure if he even knew what that meant anymore. The bitterness and hurt from the past had made him hesitant to trust, to allow himself to be vulnerable. But here, today, he was willing to open himself up to something different. They walked into the venue, where a dozen or so people were mingling, laughing, and talking. It wasn't a grand affair, no extravagant decorations or elaborate meals. It was simple, a gathering of people who enjoyed each other's company. There was no pretense, no judgment, just warmth. Ryan introduced John to several people, and each time someone shook his hand, he could feel the sincerity in their words. There was no hint of superiority, no hidden agendas. It was refreshing, a feeling that John hadn't experienced in so long. He realized that these people weren't here because of some obligation. They were here because they genuinely cared. They wanted to spend time with him, not because of what he could give them, but because they valued him for who he was. As the afternoon wore on, John found himself laughing, engaging in conversations, and feeling something that had long eluded him: peace. He wasn't carrying the burden of expectations or the weight of past mistakes. He was simply part of the gathering, a man who had found his place in a world where his worth wasn't measured by what he could provide, but by who he was. Later in the day, as the sun began to set and the sky painted itself in shades of orange and pink, John found himself standing at the edge of the property, looking out over the horizon. The vast expanse of land stretched out before him, and for the first time in years, John felt a sense of belonging that wasn't tied to his past. He wasn't defined by the mistakes of his past, nor by the guilt that had followed him for so long. He was free. Ryan approached him, his hands in his pockets, a thoughtful look on his face. "I think today went well, don't you?" John turned to his son and smiled. "Yeah, it did. I didn't know what to expect, but I'm glad I came." Ryan nodded, then looked out at the horizon with his father. "I know I haven't always been the son you wanted me to be. I know I've made mistakes, and I know I hurt you. But I'm trying to be better. I'm learning what it means to really be part of a family, to support each other, not just when it's convenient, but all the time." John's smile softened as he placed a hand on Ryan's shoulder. "I see that, son, and I'm proud of you for it. I've learned something too. Family isn't just about blood or shared history. It's about respect, love, and being there for each other. And I think, for the first time, we're starting to get that right." Ryan turned to his father, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I'm sorry, Dad. I've taken so much from you, but I never really understood what it meant to give back. I think I'm starting to get it." John nodded, his heart swelling with pride. "You are, Ryan. You are." They stood there together, father and son, as the sky above them deepened into twilight. The past wasn't gone. John knew it would always be a part of them. But the future was different. It was no longer defined by the mistakes they had made, but by the lessons they had learned and the strength they had gained from their struggles. As the evening wound down and the gathering began to disperse, John found himself sitting by the fire, surrounded by people who had shown him the true meaning of family. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about showing up, being there for each other, and understanding that relationships required effort, understanding, and above all, respect. The night was winding to a close when Ryan came over and sat beside John. They didn't need to say anything. Words weren't necessary. For the first time in years, they simply enjoyed each other's company. The weight of the past had been lifted, and in its place was something new. A bond forged not in shared burdens, but in shared understanding. As John sat there, watching the flickering flames dance in the fire, he felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known for so long. The past had shaped him, yes, but it no longer defined him. The future was wide open, and for the first time in his life, John felt that he was truly part of a family, not one defined by blood or obligation, but by mutual respect, love, and support. He had found his place, not as a man who was constantly giving, but as a man who had learned to receive, to set boundaries, and to give only when it was truly needed. He had learned the hard way, but in the end, it had made him stronger. And as the night sky stretched out above him, John Westbrook knew that he had finally found what he had been searching for all these years, a family not built on expectations, but on the true meaning of love and connection. Final thoughts. The story of John Westbrook is one of emotional growth, resilience, and redemption. It highlights the complexities of family relationships, the consequences of enabling toxic behavior, and the courage required to make difficult decisions. John's journey teaches readers the importance of self-respect, self-reliance, and the power of setting boundaries in order to preserve one's integrity. Through his journey, John comes to understand that family isn't about blood ties or shared history. It's about respect, love, and mutual support. He learns that the true meaning of family lies not in the obligations we feel, but in the connections we choose to nurture. His story serves as a powerful reminder that we all have the ability to create the family we need, the one that supports us in our growth and helps us become the best version of ourselves. For John, the lessons he learned the hard way have made him a stronger, wiser man. He has finally found peace, and with it, a new beginning, one built on the true foundations of love and respect.